Hey everybody, this is Blake here. I am reviewing The Amazing Spider-Man. If it sounds like I'm raising my voice, it's because I cannot hear out of my left ear, so I'm making sure to be as loud as possible just so I know you can understand me. With Spider-Man now, I never read the comics, and even though I watched some TV show as a kid, I can't remember any of it. Even by the time the first movie came out, I couldn't really remember any of it. But with the original trilogy, I thought they were all pretty good movies. Nothing great, but I didn't hate any of them either. With the first film, you have to remember, I think part of the reason why people loved it at the time is that really the only good superhero movie that had been made in years was X-Men. And even that isn't great either, it was just good. But with the first Spider-Man, what really stood out to me at the time, and it's been a while since I've seen any of these films, is it balanced drama and action really effectively. It never got slow, but when it came to its more dramatic sequences, like the romance or Uncle Ben's death, the turmoil that Peter was going through, it was all surprisingly well written for that type of movie. I really cared for the characters and their situations. I thought they were all interesting and developed enough to where they were not just stock movie characters. But sure, Mary Jane wasn't always likable, but I did think that she at least was fairly complex for a love interest, like these types of movies usually have. But when it came to the action, I thought it was surprisingly underwhelming. I mean, there was quite a bit of it, but with the exception of a few moments, I thought the action itself was fairly bland and generic compared to, I think, X-Men, which had come out shortly before then, which actually did have some pretty good action sequences. But Spider-Man, it just didn't really cut it in that regard, even though, yes, there were a few really good shots and a few really good sequences. But the special effects were really good for the time, except the Green Goblin's costume looked terrible. But all in all, I thought it was a solid movie. It wasn't one of the best superhero movies ever made. I guess it may have been at the time, but it's not as good as The Dark Knight or Iron Man. Hell, probably not even Iron Man 2, or certainly The Avengers. But I thought it was a solid example of the genre. Now, Spider-Man 2, a lot of people think that it's actually an improvement over the first film. I disagree, but I do think that it's in its class. I thought the drama was just as good. Maybe it's not as good, but I thought they did a good job with the character still and how he's continuing to develop. I thought the action was actually a little bit better. My only real problem with it was I thought Dr. Octopus was kind of boring. It was pretty much the same kind of character William Dafoe's Green Goblin was, with he's pretty much forced, and well, he's not forced into this, but he's just going crazy. He's not necessarily a bad person, and I like Alfred Molina, but for the most part, the character just didn't do a whole lot for me. So, I thought it was a good sequel, but not quite as good as the first film. With the third one, I thought that actually had some of the highest points in the whole trilogy. I thought the action was actually very good in that film. I thought the special effects were groundbreaking for the time. And I liked how the story. I liked most of the story. I liked how, even though there was many different villains, unlike the Batman movies where they were just cramming them all in, the villains really represented a part of Peter Parker's journey. And I thought that was really well done. I thought the villains themselves, except Venom, were pretty interesting. But what went wrong with that film, and why is it the weakest of the trilogy? Incredibly lame attempts at humor. It just goes too far. Even though I like the whole concept of Peter's, being victim to his own dark side, they just take it too far to the point where you just want to punch him in the face. By this point, I pretty much confirmed that Mary Jane is a whore because she always seems to be cheating on somebody. But and I also felt that it just sort of fell apart at the end. I mean, if it was still a pretty good movie for all its faults, during the final act, even though the action was pretty good, it just story-wise, it's just sort of collapsed in on itself. I didn't like how Sandman just got away. I thought Venom himself was surprisingly dull and boring, even though he's my favorite character, in the video games and stuff, just because he looks so awesome. I thought the character underneath the suit was surprisingly flat. You didn't really feel bad for him, but you didn't really hate him either. And it just sort of collapsed on its own weight. But I'd still say it was an okay movie, probably more an uneven movie. But as a whole, I thought the trilogy was more successful than not, and I was adamantly against this Amazing Spider-Man being made. I'm very afraid that the studios are going to figure out that they can just release the same movie over and over again, and it will still be incredibly profitable. Think about it. The Incredible Hulk, that came out like 5 years after the original, not the original, but the previous Hulk movie. That's too soon. And this one, okay, it's 10 years, which is better, but it really worries me. And what worries me even more is how the studios really do take advantage of you fanboys who buy into it's closer to the source material bullshit. You know, I stopped giving up on that when the Conan the Barbarian remake came out, because they kept really whoring that it was closer to the novels that the original movie was based on. Apparently the original novels must have been very generic and half-assed, because that's what I thought the movie was, very mediocre. So I'd much rather, even if they change shit, as long as it's compelling on screen, that's what I go for. So I was very conflicted with this movie, because it is actually a pretty good film, but for the most part, I don't think it was necessary. I don't think it was that different from the original trilogy. Yeah, they do add some stuff, like, you know, instead of Peter's webbing being part of his transformation, it's just some mechanical device. Okay, that's new. They do a little bit differently when it comes to Peter's personality. You know, he's kind of a snarky smartass when he's in the the Spider-Man costume. But for the most part, I felt like I was watching. Well, actually, let me just say this: I felt like the Amazing Spider-Man screenwriters took the basic same format of the original film and just changed the characters, added some stuff, and made sure that there were a few more tweaks that they could actually justify that it's closer to the source material argument. And the fact that the studio can justify this really scares me, because that's all they're going to do after a certain point. You know, we're going to be seeing in 5 years the new Batman remake, and they're just going to say, well, we're going to be sticking closer to the source material than Christopher Nolan did. And people will eat that shit up, and it will piss me off to no end. But enough about that. Let's just talk about the movie itself. I thought it was just about as good as the films of the original trilogy. I don't think that it's better, but I've never read the comics, so maybe if you're a comic book fan, you'll probably disagree with me. But this movie, like the original film, it does balance drama and action really well. And one thing that it definitely surpasses the original film with is its action sequences. This definitely contains the best action in any of the Spider-Man films. The fight scenes are really smooth and tightly edited, but never to the point of becoming incomprehensible. You really feel that Peter Parker, he's not just a comic book character, that you could feel the beatings he's taking. You know, every time he comes home after fighting as Spider-Man, even when he wins, he always seems bruised and beaten up. And that definitely adds a lot to that character, and as well as a lot to the action scenes, because he's no longer, you know, immortal. Like with the original trilogy, with the exception of maybe the third film, you never really feel that Peter's life is in danger. You know he's going to get through it by the end of the movie. And yes, it goes without saying, but you're not really thinking about that while you're watching it. I mean, otherwise you must have been really bored during those movies, or any action movie, when you know the main character is probably not going to die. But this one, you know, there's a sense of mortality about the action, that it's not just a bunch of special effects clashing, or a superhero fighting another superhero. You feel that, you know, somebody could really get hurt or get killed. The director does a great job at putting the fights in different locations that really add to the action. For example, I love it when the Lizard and Spider-Man fight in the sewers, because you really start feeling Peter's panic during that sequence where he's really cornered by the Lizard. You know, his web shooters are malfunctioning and shit like that. And it is a pretty intense and nail-biting sequence, so that was really good. The special effects are definitely solid, but they aren't as groundbreaking. But at the same time, with the original trilogy, it might not be fair to compare them, because, you know, back in 2002, that kind of CGI was pretty brand new. During the 90s, CGI, it was innovative, but it also kind of sucked, and it's aged very badly. But with those movies, it seemed like they started finding a way to make it a little bit more tolerable, a little bit more realistic. And with Spider-Man 3, they had some of the best CGI, I thought, of all time, at least at the time. If I watched them all again, yeah, they probably haven't aged well. And yeah, this probably does technically have the best special effects, but I wouldn't say, you know, they're amazing compared to Prometheus, or I don't know what else has come out recently, Avatar, but they're still pretty good. The Lizard's design is pretty effective. He's a much more intimidating villain than everybody, actually. I always liked Venom's design in the movie, so that's, I guess, a possible rival. But, you know, the Lizard, even when the CGI effects don't really work, I still thought he was a pretty effective villain. Even though Dr. Connors himself was kind of a rehash of William Dafoe's character, and that you feel bad for him because he's just been driven crazy. He's not necessarily a bad person, but at the same time, he's not as interesting because the movie never follows him enough. I thought the first Spider-Man did a much better job at following its characters enough to where you understand them, whereas this one, for the most part, you feel like you're watching a bunch of stock characters, but the actors make up for it. For example, Dennis Leary playing the police chief. A very flat character, but Dennis Leary is awesome, so he makes up for it. Emma Stone is playing a very typical shallow love interest. Unlike Mary Jane, there's no real nuances to the character, and yes, I said nuances, and I'm ashamed of that. But Emma Stone makes up for it because I think she's a very charming girl, and she's just interesting to watch, even though I do really hate the movies she usually appears in. I can't think of the guy who plays his name, but whoever plays Dr. Connors, he's a really good actor too, and I thought he did a good job in the role. And as Peter Parker, Andrew Garfield was definitely an improvement over Tobey Maguire. Now, Tobey Maguire, I can never really tell if he's a really good actor or really bad actor. He's one of those guys who's really introspective. He acts with his eyes, but at the same time, sometimes you feel like that's really all he can do. That there's no real range to him because he's always playing the same kind of role in each movie, and it's less about does he do a good job or a bad job in those roles as much as do those roles fit him. And I thought Peter Parker fit him pretty well, but Andrew Garfield just gives a much fuller performance. You didn't really see him as Andrew Garfield, you saw him as Peter Parker. So that's definitely a step up. The drama, even though, like I said, most of these relationships are very superficial, I was still moved by them. When Uncle Ben dies, it's a very effective moment. And Martin Sheen is actually acting again. It seems like anytime I see this guy, he's just mumbling through his lines and collecting his paychecks. But here he really seems into the role, and that definitely really made me happy because it's always nice to see Martin Sheen actually act. He's usually very good at it when he cares. But yeah, I cared for the romance too because really Garfield and Stone have good chemistry. There's nothing really to that love story, whereas with the first I keep almost saying Peter Pan, the first Spider-Man film, hopefully I haven't said Peter Pan earlier in this video, but with the first Spider-Man, I felt that the romance was much more well written, but I felt the actors had more chemistry in this movie. Is there anything else I could say? I do think that some of the major problems is that some subplots don't really go anywhere, and I can actually see why it would work for some people. For example, the whole thing with the parents is going to be explored more in the future films, but I would have rather them just not really spend so much time with it because there's no payoff here. I think they maybe should have dropped a line or two that would suggest it's going to be bigger in subsequent films, and then they could explore it in those subsequent films when there's going to be a payoff to that subplot. Here it just feels like padding, and they really could have snipped it out because this movie was kind of long. And this is actually something I've heard some people disagree with me with, like Brad Jones and his friends in that midnight screening review. I wish there was some sort of resolution to him with Uncle Ben's killer. On one hand, it is pretty bold and daring that they just kind of leave it out in the open. It's sort of a downer because that subplot is never resolved. But it seems like once the lizard comes around, they just completely forget about it. And that picture scene you see at the very end, that doesn't count. But even with these mistakes, considering there were 3 different screenwriters, at least the focus always seemed to be on Peter, even if the film occasionally isn't sure who it wants to focus on him interacting with. I thought the scenes with Uncle Ben were really effective, but at the very end, one of the major emotional payoffs is with Dennis Leary's character, and that doesn't really work because Dennis Leary's character and Peter Parker have only been together maybe 3 times prior, and they're making a big deal of this one scene. But since the movie always seems to know that it's Peter Parker's movie and it is about him, it worked because Peter Parker is an interesting character and Andrew Garfield did a great job as him. So I cared even if the movie is surprisingly superficial. And the fact that they could focus at least on that, the screenwriters, that's really impressive. Because usually when you have multiple screenwriters, it's like the Green Lantern movie, where it's going all over the place with these subplots that seemingly have no real reason to be there. So at least this was a much more successful, in terms of script compared to most of those types of movies. Is there anything else I could say? No, I'd say if you love Spider-Man in general, you probably have already seen it, but it is probably worth watching as a full price because, fuck, I'm losing my voice, because it is, I think, a good enough movie for Spider-Man fans to really enjoy. If you're like me and you aren't particularly big on Spider-Man, it's still worth a matinee, but if you didn't like any of the movies or you don't like the character in general, don't bother. If you would like to read my written review, just check the link in my description. I've released 2 Kick-Ass of Awesome episodes on YouTube if you want to check those out. One is Tiger and Crane Fists, which would become Kung Pao in the US, and the other one is Bodyguards and Assassins with Donnie Yen. So give all that a look, and I'll see you guys later.